I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Ag in the Evening program. The topic tonight's a little bit different than some of them we've done in the past, and we've set it up a little bit different. So myself, Dr. Olson, Joe Smith, and Shaniqua Davis, we all got together and kind of this is a joint effort on this presentation. I'm just going to be the one taking the lead and doing the majority of the talking, but they may comment as appropriate as we go. But we all get a lot of questions, especially from producers who have newly purchased land. What are some of the options and what are some of the things they can do with it? This is a topic that you can go a lot of different directions with. So we'll kind of focus on some of the main ones we get questions related to and then build off of that. So the first thing we would encourage anybody, whether it's new land or maybe you're thinking about going a different direction from where you've been in the past, it's important to think about what are your goals? And those goals can vary quite a bit. And then what's going to give you the most enjoyment? And so when we kind of think about those two things, a lot of people have interest in making money, and that's something a lot of us want to do. But we have to be realistic, depending on the size of the property and our situation, how much potential there is to make money, and then what enterprise may give us the best opportunity for making money. So is that livestock? And when we think about East and Central Texas, typically we're thinking about cattle from a livestock standpoint. Some people do have small ruminants. We do have a larger challenge with small ruminants from an internal parasite standpoint in our higher rainfall areas. Hay production. So hay production may provide less of a time commitment than what livestock would, and we'll talk about profit potential for both hay and livestock production here a little bit later. Some things that are outside the expertise of the main people who put this presentation together, but not that you couldn't make money off of them, but fruit production, vegetable production. Maybe you're interested in pecan production or something like that. Those are all potential uses for your operation or your land to generate some income there. Leasing. You may decide after you look and weigh all the factors out that the best thing for your situation is to lease that property out to somebody else. You still may be on it. You may still live there. But as far as hay production or from a livestock standpoint, you may decide leasing is your best option. And then there's several others, but the two we're going to kind of focus on tonight will be livestock and hay production. Then we have to realize that some of us just want to have land from an enjoyment standpoint and a lifestyle standpoint. And absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. But we have to be realistic that that's our goal. And if that's our goal, then that may impact things from an income standpoint. And maybe we're just looking to try to break even or minimize how much money we spend in that situation or lose in that situation, but we make sure we get quite a bit of enjoyment out of that. And again, that could be livestock. For some people, equine is something they really enjoy. And especially when we're talking about smaller acreage, that is something that could fit really well, but we have to, again, be realistic on what that means from an income standpoint. And especially when we talk about equine, and I'm not a horse expert by any means, but that market has changed drastically. If we think back 5 to 10 years ago versus where the market is now versus where that market may be in the future. So we have to be mindful of that. And there's all kind of other aspects of owning land from a livestock or lifestyle standpoint. Excuse me. What other uses could we have for that land? So maybe you just want to have some land that you can produce some food on. So at least some of the food that is consumed in your household, you know where that comes, whether that's feeding out livestock for slaughter production, whether that's raising or having a garden and raising vegetable crops and other crops. You just may want to generate some food. Timber production, and that could be timber production because you want to make sure that land is in the family for a long time, and that's a way to generate some profit potential off of that land, depending on what kind of timber is there and how it's managed. Maybe you're just interested in developing wildlife habitat or making sure you're protecting wildlife in your area and providing them or protecting the habitat that's already there, I should say. Maybe it's for some other kind of recreational use. And when we think about recreational use of land, there's several different things that could be happening at the same time to generate enjoyment for that land. Maybe you want to share your land with others and generate some income through ecotourism. Just need to make sure that's something you enjoy doing and you're aware of all the pros and cons of that. Maybe you want to own some land so you have a place to go hunting and fishing if that's important to you. Or maybe you can look at leasing those hunting and fishing opportunities out to others. One we've seen more and more in recent years is dedicating that land to pollinator habitat or trying to improve the habitat from a pollinator or a bee standpoint. And when we look at all these, they could be a combination of trying to generate some income, strictly livestock style, or a combination of both. And then for a lot of people, ag property tax exemption is important. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. I'm going to tell you most of what we're going to focus on tonight will not be property tax exemption because that varies so much from appraisal district to appraisal district, but we will talk about that some. And so anytime I'm having a discussion with somebody over how they're going to use their land, one of the first things we need to think about are decisions going to be made from a production ag standpoint. Are decisions going to be made from a ag property exemption standpoint, and realize local regulations will vary quite a bit. And those two things don't always align. So what may be best from a production ag standpoint may not fit with what the requirements are from a property tax exemption standpoint, and vice versa. So best way in my mind is to think about those as two separate things and figure out what's most important to you, and then you can work from there. Some other things that are very important when we're thinking about starting a new enterprise on land that's purchased or maybe some land that we've decided to lease or something is we need to think about time commitments, labor commitments, and travel considerations. So owning livestock can be very enjoyable, but we have to realize that with livestock, that does restrict what we can do at times. So it's not as easy just to pick up and go at certain times of the year on vacation or other things, especially during the winter. We're thinking about needing to be there to feed and take care of those livestock. During calving season, we need to make sure we're around. And so with livestock, there's definitely more of a time commitment and more of a, let's say, a restriction or lack of freedom of what we can do with at certain times of the year. So we have to be mindful of that. And so for some people, that may make hay a more appealing ag use of their land because it gives you a little bit more flexibility there in a lot of situations. And then depending on if we look at fruit or vegetable production, that may be just a few months out of the year, especially if we're talking about vegetable production. With fruit production, at certain times of the year, a little busier than other times of the year. And then when we think about tree nuts, the same way. And so think about what these different enterprises may mean from a time standpoint, a labor standpoint, and a travel or vacation standpoint, as well as any other enterprise you may get into. That's part of, before you get into it, really think through and decide, is this really going to fit the other goals I have from a lifestyle standpoint? Property size is a big consideration, and it's going to impact what you can do or how effectively you can do certain things. So are we talking about a 5-acre property, a 10-acre property, a 15-acre property? Are we talking more than that? Are we talking 100 acres? Are we talking 1,000 acres or even more? And so from a generating income, especially from a sole income, when we're talking about hay or livestock production, we're talking about larger enterprises. We can't do that with just a handful of acres there, just a handful of animals, and we'll work through some of that math here in a minute. So one of the things when we think about new land is forage or forage considerations are something that often are early on in the discussion process. So we thought it'd be worthwhile just to take a few minutes to talk about some of that tonight as well. So anytime we think about forage production or especially a forage system, it's important to realize that it needs to be customized to your operation, to your soil type, and to your resources. So while we may see a lot of similarities, a forage system or forage plan is not going to be identical for everybody, and it can be drastically different depending on where you're located. And we'll look at some geographical implications here on the upcoming slides. So when we think about a forage system that we would have in deep South Texas is going to be different than what we would have in East Texas, is going to be different than what we would have in West Texas. And that's also going to be different from what we would have in North Dakota or what we would have in Central California, or if we get into North Carolina. And so if we look at this map, this is what's known as a plant hardiness zone map. And so this is important from a forage standpoint. It would also be important for those producers who would be interested in some kind of a vegetable crop, a fruit crop, even a row crop. But if you look at, depending on where we're located geographically, we're going to have different temperatures. And so that's going to impact what kind of forages or what kind of plants grow best in those environments. And so if we look at the southern United States and we look along the coastlines, we have a milder climate. But as we move north and we get into the mountains, it gets colder. And as we move further north, it gets even colder. And so our forage and our plant species are going to vary. When we look at average annual precipitation, that can really impact our forage system or our forage plan as well. And so if we kind of look going from the eastern part of the United States to the western part of the United States until we get all the way back to the Gulf Coast, we go from a higher rainfall area to a lower rainfall area. So if we look here, some of the highest rainfall area we're going to see is in this corner of Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, where they all kind of intersect. We're talking a lot of times 60 to maybe 70 plus inches of annual rainfall. And that area per year, if we look at parts of Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, Panhandle, Florida, we're kind of in that 60 to 70 inch range. Dark green would kind of be that 50 to 60. Then as we get into these lighter green areas, you can see that rainfall transition quite a bit. So especially if we look at Texas, we go from an area in southeast Texas of 50 to 60 inches a year to most of East Texas, 40 to 50. As we start approaching central Texas in that I-35 corridor, we kind of drop into that 35 to 40 inch range. When we get into that I-35 corridor, that 30 to 35, and as we move west, we decrease that rainfall in Texas until we get into some areas where we're talking less than 10 inches of annual rainfall a year. So depending on where we're located, it's really going to impact our forage plan and our forage production system. And that's one of the things we have to customize too. This is just showing a little more detail in Texas. I went ahead and put locations for Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio just from a reference standpoint here, but just what we were looking at on the previous slide as well. Another thing we have to be aware of is, in addition to temperature and rainfall variations, depending on where we're located at, we have different soil types and different what we would call vegetational zones or vegetational areas of Texas. So when we think about a large part of East Texas, we're talking about the piney woods. They're kind of in the purplish color. But then you can see we also, depending on where we're located at, we may be in what we would call the post oak savanna, are the Blackland Prairies there. And then as we move west, we get into the kind of cross timbers and prairies area. We get into the rolling plains, we get into the high plains, we get into the Trans-Pecos area, the Edwards Plateau, and we'll see a little bit of variation in what forage species tend to work best in those areas. And we can see big variations in stocking rates as far as how many acres we need per cow-calf pair, or whether we can produce row crops in certain areas, whereas other areas are strictly going to be better used from a grazing livestock standpoint. Just quickly, when we think about cow-calf operations in Texas, they're going to be based off of perennial forages. And what we mean by perennial forages is those are forages that we plant, and we expect those forages to come back and grow year after year after year for 20, 30, 40 years or more in a lot of situations. Now, we do have some perennial forages that in certain environments may be shorter lived, where they're only productive for maybe 5 to 8 years. But in general, when we think about forages like Bermuda grass or Bahia grass in East Texas and Central Texas, or when we get out west and we think about some of our native perennial forages, like little blue stem and big blue stem and Indian grass, those perennial forages are going to be around for a long period of time. Now, we may have an annual forage that we plant to complement those perennial forages, but if we're thinking about a cow-calf system, we're really dealing with perennial forage base there. Just quickly, and you may have seen this slide in the presentation. This is one of my presentations. I know Dr. Olson has one pretty similar to this as well in some of her presentations. But when we think about what is the goal of a forage plan or a forage system, so if we're getting a new piece of property and we're thinking about developing that forage plan or that forage system, in my mind, we want to maximize the number of days that we're able to graze, and so minimize the number of days we're feeding hay. But it's not just about having grass out there to graze. We want to make sure that it's quality forage so that we can reduce or eliminate supplementation requirements for those cattle. We want to make sure that that forage system helps keep those cows in good body condition score. So we get them bred, they have a calf, and they wean a calf. And so we're looking at having an 85% calf crop, or what we would call wean calf crop there. And so that means if we exposed 100 cows to that bull, how many of them got bred, but then had a calf, and that calf survived to weaning? So it's not just of the ones that got bred. We need to think about all the way back to of those that were exposed to that bull. And then we want that forage production to be good so those cows can milk well and wean off a good calf. So just a little bit on forage considerations there, thinking about a new piece of property. What about some cattle considerations? So one thing we have to be mindful of, and this may be if you're helping somebody, or if you have another family member who's looking at purchasing some land, or maybe you're looking at relocating to a different environment that you're not quite as familiar with, is that we have to be mindful of realistic management expectations, and sometimes be a little careful of some of the guidelines we may see when the property is advertised. So you may see a property could support so many animals. That may or may not be realistic. So we just have to be careful with some of that real estate information that comes with the listing of the property. Just make sure you double check that and make sure it does match the location and matches the way you may plan on managing that property. Fencing is always something to be mindful of when we're dealing with a new property or changing the use of a property. And so we need to have good perimeter fences for sure. And then having some kind of cattle handling or livestock handling equipment. So kind of as a minimum for a new piece of property, and especially if we're thinking about, a smaller property, you don't want to get too much equipment, but what do you kind of need as a minimum? We need some way to at least be able to load a trailer. So if we have a sick animal or we have some kind of problem, we can get that animal loaded and go to a vet, or if it's just time to sell that animal, we have a way to get that animal loaded. And that could be pretty simple with some portable panels in that situation. Kind of the next thing we would think about is if we could have some way to restrain that animal, that would be great. So we could give vaccines if we needed to. We could treat a sick animal if we needed to, or if we had the veterinarian come out, they could help treat that animal, but it would be on our property. And that may be as simple as just a head gate, or that may be a squeeze chute in that situation. And then we have to think about what kind of equipment do we need? And it's we have to think about what equipment do we need versus what equipment do we want, and what equipment can we justify paying for the operation. And so, do you need a tractor? Well, some operations that's going to be a pretty crucial piece of equipment. In some situations, we may be able to find a way to work around without having a tractor. And then if we think about a tractor, what size tractor? So if you're wanting to handle round bales, is that tractor big enough where it can actually safely lift those round bales, whether that's off the 3 point of the tractor, or maybe there's a front end loader on that tractor? Are we going to need a sprayer? And for a lot of producers, having at least access to some kind of a sprayer could be beneficial, especially if we think about we get in a situation with army worms in the fall, is we need to protect that forage we have there. And unfortunately, with army worms, they tend to hit everybody at once. So why it may be pretty easy to get somebody to come custom spray from a weed control standpoint, that may not be an option from an armyworm standpoint. Or maybe you have some kind of arrangement in place where you can have a neighbor come over and spray, or you could use their equipment in that situation. And then what other equipment needs would be helpful in the operation, or would you want in the operation? When we think about cattle, one question that comes up, is it going to be a operation, whether it's a very small operation or a much larger operation? That would be what we would consider a cow-calf operation. And when we talk about a cow-calf operation, you're going to have those cows. They're hopefully going to have a calf each year. And then we're likely going to sell that calf after weaning, when that calf is 6 to 8 months of age, or maybe a little bit older. When we talk about a stocker operation, we're buying somebody else's calves, we're growing them typically on grass and increasing weight on them, and that may be increasing weight by anywhere from 100 to 400 pounds, depending on the situation. And then those animals would typically be sold to a feedlot. With the cow-calf operation, that's something you're going to have those animals year round. They're going to be having calves, but some people really enjoy that. So they get to see those newborn babies, and that's part of their enjoyment of having that land. Other people would prefer not to hassle with that. And so they may be looking at a stocker operation. Now, I will tell you from a stocker standpoint, there's more risk there from both a market standpoint and an animal health standpoint. So starting out, I think cow-calf may work a little bit better for a lot of producers. If you do want to start out from a stocker standpoint, what I would really suggest there is find somebody you can buy a healthy weaned calf from directly, and typically looking at buying a heifer there. And you could grow that heifer from, say, 6 months of age to breeding age, which would be 14, 15 months of age. And then you could sell that heifer either to go into the feedlot, or you could sell that heifer as a potential breeding animal to somebody else. But I would really caution somebody that's just getting into the business to just go to the local auction market and buy calves. That can be a pretty high risk venture there if you don't have the right experience in those situations. Another thing we have to think about from a cattle standpoint is how many acres do we need per cow-calf pair? And this is going to vary from a production recommendation versus a ag tax exemption recommendation. And so what I'm going to focus on now is from a production standpoint. And so I will tell you, regardless of what you may see on the internet, there's nowhere in the state of Texas where we can run a cow-calf pair to 1 acre of land. That just does not happen in our environment. In fact, when we look across the US, there's very, very few places we can do this. I actually was asked to give a presentation on this several years ago for the Southeastern United States. So I reached out to all my colleagues across the Southeast and said, tell me what's the most common stocking rate in your area and how it varies and what percentage of the state could be stocked at various levels. I only had one colleague come back, and in a certain part of Georgia, with quite a bit of fertilization, they could get by with 1 acre per cow-calf pair. Nobody else in the entire Southeast would that fit. When we look at our environment, it's going to depend on how much rainfall you get, how much nitrogen fertilizer you want to put out. But I would say for most people, you're looking at a minimum of about 2.5 to 3 acres per cow-calf pair. If we're not going to put fertilizer out, or if we're dealing with a forage that's less productive, say Bahia grass, then a lot of times we're looking at maybe 5 acres per cow-calf pair. As we move west and get into lower rainfall environments, that number goes up. When we get into some of our native range country and that 25 to 30-inch rainfall zone, we're probably looking at somewhere between 12 to 15 acres per cow-calf pair. When we get out west into some of that less productive country, we may be looking at 100 acres per cow-calf pair. So it really depends on where we're at, but we have to be mindful. If we only have 5 acres, then it's really going to be unrealistic that we're going to have 5 or 6 cows in that situation. That's just way too much for that ground. So we have to be mindful of that. Another thing we have to be mindful of if somebody does want to have some cows is how are we going to get those cows bred? And a lot of people just purchasing land and new to the business think, well, I'm going to use artificial insemination or AI. And that's a great tool. The thing we have to realize is that's not 100%. So just because we AI an animal doesn't mean it's going to become pregnant. And so we're either looking at having to AI multiple times or to AI and then still have a cleanup bull in that situation. So that's something we have to be mindful of. And we'll talk about some options for smaller land areas from a breeding standpoint. And maybe even if you're a bigger producer and you have smaller producers coming in around you, maybe something you can do to work with them that benefits both operations. So another thing we need to think about, we started the presentation talking about for a lot of people with land, they're wanting to generate some income from that land. So from a cattle standpoint, what would be realistic? And so it's important to realize that the value of calves will change from year to year. Those of you who've been in the business for a long time know that very well. Those who may just be getting into the business realize we're at record high calf prices, and with time, those prices will go down. They go up and down over time, so it's important to be aware of that. We're never going to have 100% calf crop, and so now I realize, when we're dealing with small numbers, say we're dealing with 3 to 5 head, all those may breed every year for 1 or 2 or 3 years and have a calf. But if we think about over time, there's going to be times where they're going to miss. And so when we really think about dealing with bigger numbers or small numbers, but numerous calf crops over time, 80 to 85% weaned calf crop is probably what we want to be thinking about from a budgetary standpoint. And realize some producers are below this number. Some producers would be a little above this number. So it's not, you have a cow, you have a calf to sell every year. Unfortunately, just doesn't work quite that well. The other thing is depending on how people are paying attention to their costs and how they're set up from a forage standpoint and how much money they've spent on equipment, that when we actually account for cow depreciation, we account for a opportunity cost for that land. So let's say we at least put a 10 to 15 dollar per acre opportunity cost, because that's we could lease it for that or more. We account for our expenses accurately. We account for equipment purchases and depreciate that out over those cattle for the appropriate number of years across the appropriate number of head. And here I'm talking about not from a tax standpoint, but actually a profit or loss potential for the cow-calf enterprise. When we accurately account for everything, there's a lot of producers who are actually losing money in the cow-calf business. Now, they don't want to look at it that way because a lot of times they want to forget about all the expenses and just look at, well, this is what the check was when I sold those calves, or they're wanting to spend extra money from a tax standpoint, and so they feel good about that, and so they're not worried about the others. That's all fine. It's just important to realize if income is a primary driver, that when we do accurately account for that, there's quite a few people who do lose money. Does that mean everybody's losing money? Absolutely not. There's people who can generate a good income from cattle. We have to be mindful of what that income is realistically per cow calf pair. And so if we're thinking about trying to generate income from a retirement standpoint or those kind of things, how many animals we would actually need. I will tell you, I've had a lot of conversations over the years where somebody who was not familiar with agriculture was wanting to get into the cattle business and hoping with 10 or 12 cows, they could generate a full retirement income similar to what they were making before they retired. And unfortunately, that's just not going to be realistic. For those producers who are doing a better job from a cost standpoint and from a production standpoint and are generating income, when we kind of look at some more longer term numbers, I would suggest from a budgeting standpoint, budget a income potential of $50 to $200 per head. Now, will a lot of producers make more than that this year and next year? Absolutely, because calf prices are so high. But we have to realize that those calf prices go down, and so we kind of have to average that out over time. So that's a pretty good number to start with from a planning standpoint. So what if we're dealing with less acreage? So I just kind of said less than 15, and you could set this number a lot of different places. I'm going to set it for 15 for the purposes of this discussion. Is realize if we're talking about 15 acres, even if we talked about 3 acres per cow-calf pair, which would be pretty aggressive, and let's just assume all the acreage was grazable. So if there's part of that that's in woods or part of that that's in a house or a shop or something else, we would need to subtract some off that number. But let's just say all of it was grazable. We're really looking at 4, maybe 5 pairs there, depending on what we're going to do from a bull standpoint. If that's what we're running, we're not going to be able to use that livestock to pay for a tractor or to pay for a farm truck or to pay for other equipment we may want to have. And so we just have to realize that if we want to have that equipment because we want to have that equipment, that's great. We just can't expect the livestock to pay for it in that situation. And so, especially when we're dealing with less acreage, we may want to consider hiring somebody to do that spraying we talked about earlier, hiring somebody to put out that fertilizer for us and even put out that hay. Now, obviously, if you wanted to put out little square bales, you could do that without equipment, but most people are looking to put out round bales. And so we're going to have at least a moderate sized tractor or bigger to do that, or to have a pickup with hay forks or something on the back of it. And that's just if you try to spread those kind of costs out across 4 to 5 cows, you can do that math in your head real quick and see that's just not going to work. And so maybe it's most cost effective to pay somebody to do some of those things for you. One thing you may look at is if you have a larger neighbor that's already in the cow-calf business and you're buying some smaller land area next to them, you may see if you could buy some cows from them if you want to own those cows, but then work out a relationship that when it comes time to breed those cows, you put those cows back into their herd for a couple of months with the bulls, you pay them a fee to do that. And so then you don't have to worry about maintaining a bull. As a bigger producer who's already in the business, if you have somebody coming in next to you that has a smaller piece of property, this could be advantageous to you, because then if you work out a relationship where you can do it appropriately and both parties are happy, then you're not having to worry about their bull getting in with your herd and causing problems. And so it can be advantageous from that standpoint. If and this is for both parties involved, is you have to be mindful of trick, and trick is a protozoal parasite that's spread through breeding activity. It's only spread through breeding activity. So it's just important you know the history of those cows. And so that's why I mentioned buying the cows from the neighbor, because you would know the history there. And so they would be much more comfortable of allowing you to put those cows back in with their herd. I know of some producers who are already doing this. They really like it because it just simplifies things from them, from not bulls not tearing fences up, not having to worry about a bull with an unknown history, or cows with unknown history getting into the herd and causing biosecurity issues there and those kind of things. So there's ways both parties, small or large, could work that out to be beneficial. So those were a few things to think about from a cattle standpoint, a few things to think about from a hay standpoint. So let's talk about income and production considerations a little bit. One thing you have to decide, are you going to put up little square bales or big round bales, and what markets would each one of those best fit in? And then what are the labor considerations? So with the big round bales, a whole lot less labor required there. With the little square bales, while there is some equipment to make that much easier, there is still going to be more labor involved. When you look at potential customers, are you looking to try to target that horse or that equine market? Are you looking to just try to supply hay to the cattle market? Or maybe you're going to target sheep and goat or some other type of market. With the horse or equine market and the sheep or goats, we're definitely probably looking at small square bales most of the time in that situation, although there may be some market for a larger round bale. When we're thinking about cattle, we're really talking about round bales in those situations. It's important to realize the value of hay changes quite a bit from year to year, depending on weather conditions. So we don't want to take this year and budget for the next 10 on what hay is going to be worth, because it's bringing quite a bit of more money, because so much of the country was in drought this spring and summer. Does the hay have to be stored inside, or can it be stored outside? Anytime we're talking about square bales, whether they're little square bales or big square bales, they're going to need to be stored in a barn. With round bales, they could be stored outside. If you're trying to go into the horse market with them, they're going to need to be stored inside in that situation. And then we've already talked about labor a little bit. So what about income? And so I just went ahead and worked this example off of round bales. Obviously, with square bales, they would be worked a little bit more, but you would have some more labor involved there. And so you can decide what fits for your scenario. But if we think about the value of a 1,000-pound round bale, easily this year, $45 to $80 could be quite a bit more, depending on the situation. I know people are paying much more than that for it, but for an example standpoint, I don't want to get into those extreme numbers. So let's say per acre, well-managed forage, well-fertilized, sprayed, we produce 6,000 pounds of production at today's fertilizer prices. And what I did here was price how much nutrients would leave that property with the hay, and so how much fertilizer would be needed to account for their removal. And then we're going to have some nitrogen loss in that situation, so I figured about a 10% nitrogen loss. You could argue you may want to figure a little bit more nitrogen loss than that. These are prices that Dr. Corey Olson obtained from one of the fertilizer companies actually yesterday. And so these are current prices. So with 6,000 pounds of forage production, the fertilizer value that would be leaving with that plus 10% nitrogen overage, we're looking at $192. Herbicide and insecticide cost per acre, I figured just chemical cost of $22 acre. application costs, that could vary quite a bit, but thinking about fertilizer application as well as a couple applications of herbicide, and hopefully you're throwing the insecticide in at the same time the herbicide, I said $12. You could argue you may want to make that a little bit higher. That's just the application cost. That's not a full equipment depreciation cost there by any means. Let's say instead of trying to own the hay equipment, you're going to hire somebody to come in and custom do that. And we see those prices ranging from about $25 to $35 per round bale on custom baling. In small operations, there may be a minimum charge to get that equipment there, so be aware of that. But for math purposes, I just went ahead and said $30 per bale. So what do we have cost per bale? So if we think about our fertilizer or herbicide and our application, that'd be $226 per acre divided by 6 bales would be $37.67 per bale in fertilizer, herbicide, and application cost, plus a $30 charge for baling. We're looking at almost $68 per bale just in cost. So depending on where you're at in that range of $45, you're losing money or making just a little bit of money. So again, it may be the break even. You get your tax exemption. If you meet the requirements for the appraisal district, you're happy with that. But just realize it's not going to be a huge income generation on a smaller property. Now, if we're talking about a few hundred acres, then we can generate some meaningful income in those situations if you get a good market established. Again, looking at our less than 15 acre scenario, you're not going to be able to pay for any hay equipment. So that's why I looked at using the custom in that situation. And with small acreage from a hay standpoint, you may consider letting somebody cut on halves. So they take half the hay, you take half the hay. Now, they may not be willing to do that if there's only a couple bales, or you may work out a deal with somebody where they're going to fertilize it, they're going to spray it. You're not going to charge them anything, but for doing that and keeping that ground maintained, they would get the hay off of it. There's no system that's perfect there. It's just important you find something that makes both parties happy. And I would say it'd be critical to get that in writing just so everybody remembers what it is in the future and everybody's clear. And so it helps reduce any kind of frustration down the road. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about ag tax exemptions. I'm not an ag tax lawyer, nor are any of the other folks I mentioned earlier. So we're providing this just from an educational standpoint. It's very important that you visit with your local tax appraisal district and see what their requirements are. Those requirements are going to vary district by district. We're going to look at Gregg County and Houston County here in a minute, just from an example standpoint, to kind of look at a more rural county and a more urban county. And Shaniqua and Joe may chime in here in a minute if I leave something out that they've seen pretty common in those counties. And then also realize there may be differences in record keeping by appraisal district. And so you need to be mindful of that if you're thinking about an ag tax exemption or a 1D1 exemption in those situations. So I realize this is small. I didn't want to, my intention was not for everybody to be able to read everything, but just to kind of show you what you may get from various appraisal districts. And then I'm just going to highlight a few things. So this would be from Houston County. And so they have one document here that's for general information on qualifications for agricultural use appraisal. They talk about minimum land area. And so they have a minimum land area of 10 acres. So if you're less than 10, then it's not going to qualify, at least in their county, based off of these guidelines, but talk to the appraisal office. And then a minimum number of head. And so their minimum number of head is 5 in that situation. And they call a cow an animal unit. Realize there's a lot of different definitions for animal units from a grazing standpoint. It's a little different than what it is from a tax appraisal standpoint. The way I kind of think about it, the way it's presented here is kind of think about an adult animal Generally, when we're talking about a cow, that would be one animal unit. They're talking about a minimum of 5 there. They may or may not count replacement heifers or stockers. That would be a conversation you would need to have with them. But in addition to the minimum number of animals, there's a minimum number of acres per animal, which would actually, when you do the math there, would exceed that 10 that would apply to other situations there. Some counties will let you do a timber exemption, but they're going to have requirements that you have to follow there. And so that next document is Houston County's timber qualifications, general information. This is one that I don't recall seeing in the past, but I guess really the last maybe 15 years or so, you started seeing this one start come up some more. Some counties will allow beekeepers an exemption there. So if that's something that fits from your enjoyment standpoint and something you're interested in, if you can meet the appraisal district requirements for that, that may be an option for that as well. You can see here, depending on the number of acres, they actually specify how many active hives and other information you have to have in that situation. And in addition to the county requirements, there's actually some requirements for the state of Texas when it comes to bees and ag exemptions in that situation. So those would be 3 documents from Houston County. The documents that Shaniqua sent that I've included here from Gregg County, there's a few more here. And so you can see this is from their 2023 standards and intensity schedules for qualifying productive property evaluation for the Gregg County Appraisal District. They actually specify hay production. Are you cutting and baling the hay yourself, or someone else cutting and baling the hay? Kind of one of the interesting things to me when I was skimming through this was if somebody else is cutting and baling the hay, there's a requirement for the number of receipts that you have to have based on fertilizer, spraying, and those kind of things. So there may be record keeping requirements depending on which one of these valuations you're interested in. And this kind of highlights some of those differences from county to county. So make sure you check with your appraisal district and don't just go off of what you hear or what a friend or a family member may tell you if they could be located in a different appraisal district. Again, the top of the page here would be the number of active colonies. If you were looking at bees, orchards or vineyards, there could be exemptions there. And then it talks about the number of trees per acre in that situation, or the number of plants per acre. Truck crops, which a lot of us would think about vegetable crops. Grazing pasture, different requirements depending on if it's your livestock that are grazing or if you're leasing that out to somebody else, and a written lease agreement may be required there, which that's beneficial even if it's not required from a tax standpoint, just to keep everybody on the same page and prevent any confusion down the road. They break out in a little more detail as far as cows and bulls versus calves versus goats and sheep versus brood mares or jennies. And depending on whether it's what they would consider improved pasture, which is what we typically refer to as introduced pasture, and thinking about Bermuda grass a lot of times, native pasture, or they even have a brush pasture situation here. And so if we look at the cows from an improved pasture standpoint, a minimum of 16 acres from a native pasture, and we really don't have much native pasture in East Texas anymore, a minimum of 20 acres. And if it's a pasture that has a fair bit of brush in it, depending on how they define a brush pasture, a minimum of 25 acres. So you would want to make sure you're clear on all that, and that you're going to interpret it the same way that the appraiser would and that appraisal district. And they even have here 4-H and FFA project specific statements there that they're typically not going to qualify in those situations. So make sure you're aware of that as well. From a timber standpoint, they have a couple pages on timber here. I know when we were talking about putting this together, Shaniqua mentioned that a timber management plan is required, and typically that may be done through the Texas Forest Service. And if that's something you're interested in, it's important that you plan ahead so you have plenty of time to get that timber management plan in place. You know, if you wait till just a week or two before you need to get your paperwork, they may not be able to get that plan done for you based on demand from others as well. So be aware of those kind of things. And then some appraisal districts will allow for a wildlife exemption, but there's some pretty strict requirements there. You can see here a minimum of 12 and a half acres for what they classify as rural acres, 10 acres from a subdivision standpoint. And so you can see just from those two appraisal districts and just slight variations in things, how much things can change. So really make sure you do your homework, you get the right information from the appraisal office so that you're not frustrated in the end there. Some other resources kind of from a new landowner standpoint or new property purchase standpoint that may or may not be related to tax exemption is always in all counties in the state of Texas, there's going to be a county extension agent. So they're a great resource for you on information, and they may be the one to help answer that, or they may be able to point you in the direction. So like we talked about those timber plans, that's something that county agents typically wouldn't do, but they'll be able to point you in the direction of what agency could help you do that. The Ag in the Evening YouTube channel. So most of these presentations like this tonight, we will record and have on our YouTube channel so you can watch those later, or maybe you have somebody you want to share those with. Dr. Olson's Forage Facts, you can sign up for that. If we look at, if you're interested in some stuff from Tiffany Lastmet, who is a lawyer that does a lot of an extension specialist for Texas A&M. She has publications on leasing and several other aspects of ag law. So Ranchers Agricultural Leasing Handbook can be found at that website on the screen. She has a publication on owning your piece of Texas and then several online courses. If you're interested in wildlife, don't forget about Texas Parks and Wildlife and some of the information they have available. And then USDA, especially through the NRCS office and the EQIP cost share program that you may be able to take advantage of. For an example, may be able to cost share on cross fence. They won't cost share on perimeter fence. They may be able to cost share on planning a new forage, depending on the situation and depending on what your county. And then the USDA Web Soil Survey is a great tool to learn about the differences in soil types you may have on your property and how that can impact that forage management plan we talked about earlier, or how it may impact other plants that you want to plant. If you're looking at planting pecan trees or a peach orchard or a vineyard or something, you're really going to need to know what that soil type is and see if it's conducive to those. So that's what we kind of wanted to cover tonight. I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. And Vanessa, Joe, Shaniqua, any comments that I left out that you want to go ahead and add, please do that as well. Great. Thanks for the feedback. I'm glad you enjoyed the topic tonight. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other messages come in, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up for this evening, and everybody have a good week.